Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The day Claire left her phone on the passenger seat was the day my world cracked. We'd been married for 10 years, and I'd always been the trusting type, the type to dismiss small quirks and signs as paranoia. But that day, when she dashed into the store and her phone lit up with a notification, something felt different. It wasn't a hunch or gut feeling. It was that message, an intimate text from a guy named John from work, a name she'd mentioned in passing but never quite in that way. The text wasn't outright incriminating but was certainly odd, the kind of message that could almost pass as friendly but, if read with a slightly suspicious lens, hinted at something deeper. I wasn't even sure what I was reading at first. Just a simple, "Miss you already. Can't wait for next time," with a winking face that seemed all too familiar. My heart thundered, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told myself I was overthinking, that it could be nothing. But as much as I wanted to believe that, something inside me couldn't let it go. I left the text unread and slipped her phone back where she'd left it, glancing up to see her walking back to the car, oblivious to the storm churning inside me. I knew confronting her now would be foolish. I had nothing concrete, and a confrontation would only lead to her denying it, calling me paranoid. So I tucked it away, like a bruise hidden under a sleeve, throbbing just beneath the surface. That evening, I could barely keep my eyes off her. She moved through our kitchen like she always did, humming some half-remembered tune, her eyes bright with a happiness I hadn't noticed before. Was it him who made her smile like that? I felt sick, but I kept my face neutral, hoping she'd miss the tension in my jaw, the tightness in my words. We ate dinner, talked about the kids' schoolwork, and went about our evening routine. But inside, I felt like a stranger in my own home, sitting beside a woman I no longer recognized. Over the next few days, I kept close tabs on her. She didn't notice anything different, not the way I lingered a little longer when she'd leave the room to take a call or how I'd glance at her phone out of the corner of my eye whenever she unlocked it. I could feel myself slipping, turning into someone I never thought I'd be. But I had to know the truth. I had to be sure. Then came the night that confirmed it. Claire told me she had to stay late for a work meeting, some big project she claimed needed her attention. Usually, I'd have taken her at her word, even reassured her, but this time I was ready. I'd already checked the calendar at her office online, no late meetings, no project on the horizon. I kissed her goodbye, told her I'd have dinner waiting when she got home, and then watched as she drove away. I waited 15 minutes before I slipped out myself, tracking the route I'd mapped out on my phone, following her car at a safe distance. It felt surreal, like a twisted movie scene. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, my stomach a knot of dread and anger, but I kept driving, kept my focus sharp. She pulled into a parking lot, dimly lit and tucked away behind an office complex. It wasn't her office, and it certainly wasn't home. I parked a few spaces away, just close enough to see her step out of the car and walk across the lot. And there he was. I recognized him from the company picnic, John from work, a tall guy with an easy smile, always a little too friendly for comfort. He leaned casually against his car, and when she approached, he pulled her in close, pressing his lips to hers in a way that erased any last shred of doubt. I felt a cold numbness wash over me as I watched them, my mind too stunned to process what was happening. There was no ambiguity, no way to misinterpret what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I'd built a life with, was cheating on me. My hands shook as I clenched the steering wheel, 1,000 words, 1,000 accusations fighting to burst free. But I said nothing. I did nothing. I just sat there, silent, watching my life fall apart before my eyes. I stayed there, frozen, until they finally parted ways. She walked back to her car, glancing around like a thief in the night. I let her leave, following her at a distance, trailing behind her like a shadow as she drove back home. The irony stung, I was the one chasing her now, the loyal, faithful husband, following his wife's betrayal like a ghost. That night, I barely slept. The anger, the humiliation, the disbelief churned inside me like a storm I couldn't quiet. I went over every memory, every conversation, every late night she'd claimed was for work. It all felt tainted now, every small moment unraveling into something ugly and twisted. I wanted to confront her, to throw the truth in her face, to make her feel the shame I felt. But I held back. I'd come this far in silence, and I realized that silence was my greatest weapon. In the morning, I moved through the routine as if nothing had changed, even as my heart pounded with a cold determination. Over breakfast, I told her I wanted to take some time for myself, maybe even a little trip. I watched her reaction carefully, waiting for the slightest flicker of guilt or fear. But she barely looked up, nodding as though it were nothing more than me wanting a quiet weekend. "Take all the time you need," she said, her voice light, oblivious. I forced a smile. "Thanks, Claire. I think it'll do me good." She smiled back, and for the first time, I realized that I didn't recognize her anymore. She'd become a stranger, someone who wore my wife's face but no longer held the woman I'd married. I took my time planning. Anger was there, smoldering beneath the surface, but I knew better than to rush. The truth was, I'd already seen what could happen to people who acted on impulse, letting their fury drive them to confrontations that only led to more lies and hurt. I wasn't going to be that guy. If she thought she'd walk away from this without consequence, she had another thing coming. For the next week, I played the part of the clueless husband to perfection. I acted cheerful, attentive, the man who had it all. The hardest part was not snapping every time I saw her texting with that slight smile or catching her humming to herself, as if she were a teenager in love. I even helped with the little things, organizing bills, cleaning the garage, making dinner. She didn't suspect a thing. Each evening, I'd wait for her to put her phone down or leave it unattended, and I'd check her messages. She didn't bother to hide it. There was no code on her phone, and she hadn't bothered to erase their texts. Her arrogance astounded me. Maybe she thought I was so stupid, so oblivious, that I'd never even think to look. Or maybe it was part of the thrill, getting away with it right under my nose. Every message between her and John felt like a punch in the gut, like salt in an open wound, but I kept reading, taking in every detail. One message stood out. She was planning another work trip for the weekend, a romantic getaway she'd dressed up as a business conference in a city nearby. She told me she'd be gone for a few days, even adding a thoughtful, "I'll miss you so much, honey," that made my skin crawl. But I played along, pretending to be supportive, even packing her a lunch for the road and making a show of waving goodbye as she left. The second she was out of sight, I went into action. First, I called a lawyer. Divorce had always been a foreign word to me, something I'd never thought would apply to my life. But here I was, sitting across from a stranger, laying out the intimate details of my marriage's collapse. She listened, nodding, her face a practiced mask of sympathy as I explained the situation. When I finished, she leaned forward, offering a game plan with a level of precision that took my breath away. This woman wasn't messing around. She laid it out plainly: document everything, and don't let her catch on. Gather every bit of evidence you can. Financials, messages, her itinerary for these work trips. This will work in your favor, especially if you want custody of the kids. Her voice softened, and she added, "I'm sorry you're going through this, but you're doing the right thing by being methodical." I nodded, feeling a strange, grim satisfaction. Every step I took felt more resolute, like I was piecing together armor around myself, shielding myself from the lies and betrayal. After the meeting, I went home, pulled out a notebook, and started writing everything down: the messages, her patterns, every little suspicion that had piled up over the months. Each line I wrote felt like a weight lifting, each detail a reminder that I wasn't imagining things. This was real. On Friday morning, she left for her business trip. She was practically glowing, her face lit up with that excitement she never bothered to show me anymore. I kissed her goodbye, told her to drive safe, and watched her pull out of the driveway with a pit in my stomach. I waited until she was a few miles down the road before following, giving her just enough of a head start to stay out of sight. She'd told me she was headed to a conference downtown, but I had a feeling that wasn't exactly true. Sure enough, I trailed her car as she took a turn toward a small, boutique hotel on the edge of town. My stomach churned as I watched her park, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror before stepping out of the car. I parked a safe distance away, watching as she met up with John by the hotel entrance, his arm already snaking around her waist. She leaned into him, laughing, and they walked inside together. I sat in my car, fists clenched, feeling a rage unlike anything I'd ever known. I knew I couldn't storm in there. That wasn't the plan. Instead, I took a few pictures from the car, just enough to document the proof I'd need. Each snap of the camera felt like another piece of armor, another layer between me and the devastation she'd brought into my life. I snapped one last picture as they disappeared into the hotel, then drove off, heart pounding, hands shaking. I spent that night in a rented apartment, courtesy of a close friend who was more than willing to lend a sympathetic ear when I told him the bare minimum of what had happened. He offered to stay, to talk, but I was too exhausted, too consumed by everything that had happened. So I sat alone, staring at the wall, mind spinning with the memories, the betrayal, the plan that was starting to take shape in my head. The next morning, I returned home, waiting for Claire as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I wasn't sure how I'd feel when I saw her again, whether I'd be able to hide the hatred that was boiling in my blood. But when she walked through the door, she acted as if nothing had happened, throwing her arms around me, greeting me with a bright, cheery, "Hey, honey. Miss me?" I forced a smile, playing along. Of course. How was the conference? Oh, exhausting, she sighed, flopping down on the couch. You know how it is. Lots of boring meetings, barely any time to relax. Her lies were so easy, so casual. I could see how little she thought of me, how convinced she was that I'd believe anything she said. It made my stomach turn, but I kept my face neutral, kept my responses short and supportive. I wasn't going to tip my hand. Not yet. Over the next few days, I kept a distance, pulling myself inward as I finalized everything with the lawyer. We agreed on the timing, the best moment to serve her, the arrangements for the house and the kids. Every detail was set, and I felt like a man heading into battle, calm and steady. I didn't want her to see the fury inside me, didn't want her to catch a single hint of what was coming. I'd seen her go on enough of these trips, seen enough messages, and watched enough of her cold, careless deception to know I was ready. Finally, the day came. I was in my office, going over the last of the paperwork with the lawyer. She looked at me with a firm nod, sliding the final documents across the desk. It's all set, she said. She'll be served today. After that, it's up to you. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger swirling inside me. I'd spent weeks planning, documenting, acting like the oblivious husband, and it was all coming down to this moment. Part of me wanted to be there, to watch her face when she realized I knew, to see the shock as her little game crumbled around her. But I knew that would be giving her too much satisfaction, too much control. Instead, I went home, took a long shower, and waited. By the time I got home, I felt a strange sense of calm. All the plotting, the watching, the waiting, it was over. Now it was just a matter of time, waiting for the inevitable call. I settled in with a drink, letting the silence of the house wash over me, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The call came sooner than expected. She tried my cell first, then the house line. I didn't answer. My plan was to let her stew, to feel the silence, the absence. I wanted her to wonder what she would come home to, what I might know. A part of me felt like it was a game, a twisted one, but it was all I had to reclaim any dignity in this mess. So I sat there, watching the minutes tick by, sipping my drink and waiting. Eventually, a text came through. Please pick up, it read. I ignored it, letting her panic build. Another text followed, this one more frantic, where are you? I need to talk to you. I still didn't respond. The door finally opened a couple of hours later, her footsteps quick and uncertain as she entered the house. I heard her stop in the entryway, probably checking to see if I was nearby, feeling for the first time what it was like to be on the other side of this sick game. Tom, she called, her voice tight, almost desperate. Are you here? I took my time. I waited a beat before stepping into the living room, leaning casually against the doorway, letting her see the coolness in my gaze. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as they locked onto mine. She didn't seem like the confident, carefree woman who just spent a weekend with her lover. No, she looked exactly as she was, someone who had been caught, someone who knew the game was up. I'm here, I said, voice steady, void of the warmth she was probably expecting. She swallowed, eyes darting to the floor, then back to me. Tom, I don't know what happened today. I got served these papers at work, and I don't know what's going on. She was stumbling over her words, her hands clutching her purse in a white-knuckled grip. I kept my gaze level, not giving her an inch. Oh, you don't know what's going on. I said slowly, letting every word sink in. You don't know why you'd be served with divorce papers. Really, Claire? Her face contorted, a mix of anger and pleading, as though she were scrambling to find some excuse, some way out of this mess. But her eyes told the truth. She knew exactly why she was served. The mask she wore, the lies she'd woven, were crumbling right before her. Tom, it's not what you think, she started, her voice thick with desperation. I was just feeling disconnected. We've been so busy, you with work and me with the kids, and it just happened. It was a mistake. I laughed, cold and hard, the sound echoing through the empty house. A mistake. I repeated, each word like a strike. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Claire. A mistake is not picking up milk on the way home. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. She flinched, but I didn't stop. I know about every lie, Claire. Every single work trip. The texts, the meetings. I've seen the messages, the pictures. You made it so easy, parading around right in front of me, thinking I'd never catch on. The fury I'd kept at bay for so long was flooding out now, each word sharper than the last. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked as though she'd been struck, as if hearing me say it out loud made it real. Finally, she sank onto the couch, her face in her hands, her voice choked. I don't know why I did it, she whispered, almost to herself. I thought you'd never find out. I let the silence stretch, watching her crumble, letting the weight of her actions sink in. Part of me felt satisfaction, seeing her realize what she'd done. But beneath it, there was something else, a hollowness, a feeling that even this scene, even this moment, couldn't fix what she'd shattered. Why, Claire? I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why would you throw it all away? She looked up at me, her face wet with tears. I don't know. I felt like something was missing, and John was there, and it felt exciting, and I thought maybe. She trailed off, as though realizing how flimsy her excuses sounded, how pathetic they were in the face of what she'd destroyed. I shook my head, disgusted. Exciting, I echoed. You were bored. So you decided that lying to me, betraying me, was a better option than talking to me? Than trying to work on our marriage? Her voice broke, her hands twisting in her lap. I was wrong. I see that now. I never wanted to hurt you, Tom. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Well, it did, I replied coldly, not letting her weasel her way out of this. And now, you have to face the consequences. She started to cry then, real tears, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a hard resolve. She wasn't my problem anymore. Her tears couldn't fix the betrayal, couldn't undo the damage she'd caused. After a long silence, she looked up, her voice trembling. "Can't we try to work through this? For the kids? I know I've made mistakes, but we've been together so long. Doesn't that mean anything?" I took a deep breath, my chest tight as I looked at her. This was the woman I'd built my life with, the mother of my children, the person I'd once trusted more than anyone. But looking at her now, all I could see was the stranger who'd betrayed me, who'd broken the vows we'd once shared. "No, Claire," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. "We're done. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached for me, but I stepped back, keeping my distance. The sight of her hurt, her despair, barely registered. I felt like I was looking at a ghost, a shadow of the woman I'd once loved. And maybe that's what she was, a ghost of the life we'd built, a life that was dead and gone. "Please, Tom," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Please, don't do this." I shook my head, my resolve firm. "It's already done, Claire. You made your choice the moment you decided that I wasn't enough, that our family wasn't enough." I took a step back, feeling a strange weight lift off my shoulders. "Now you have to live with it." I walked out of the room, leaving her there, her sobs echoing through the empty house. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a clarity that hadn't been there before. She would stay until we sorted out the logistics, but I knew I was already gone, already free from the lies and betrayal that had poisoned our lives. As I walked away, I realized I didn't need revenge. This was enough. The weeks following that confrontation were a blur. Claire had moved into the guest bedroom, a silent arrangement as we each navigated our new reality. The house felt hollow, the walls echoing the life that had once filled it with warmth and laughter. She avoided me, shuffling around the house like a shadow, barely speaking. But in those quiet moments, when our paths crossed in the kitchen or the hallway, I'd catch glimpses of her face, drawn, haunted, a sadness etched deep within her features. I told myself it didn't matter. This was what she deserved. Our kids, Emma and James, were caught in the middle of the unraveling of everything they'd known. They were old enough to sense something was wrong but still too young to understand the full weight of what had happened. We told them we were figuring things out, that Mom and Dad needed space. They looked at us with wide, questioning eyes, and I saw the fear creeping in, the uncertainty. A few days later, Claire asked if we could talk, her voice barely more than a whisper. I met her gaze, my walls firmly in place, already bracing myself for whatever excuses she might offer this time. But instead, she looked different. Fragile. "Tom," she began, her hands fidgeting, her gaze lowered. "I know I can't fix what I did. I know I don't deserve forgiveness." Her voice cracked, and she looked up at me, her eyes hollowed with guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. "But I need you to know. I loved you. I still do. I was stupid, selfish, but please don't ever think it was because you weren't enough." I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. I wanted to believe her, to let those words pierce through the anger I'd built up. But they felt like echoes of a love that had long faded, too little, too late. I nodded curtly, offering no comfort, and she swallowed, nodding as though she'd expected nothing else. As days turned into weeks, Claire seemed to grow more withdrawn, shrinking further into herself with each passing day. She went through the motions with the kids, helping with homework, making dinner, but her spirit was gone, her light dimmed. I told myself it was guilt, that she was feeling the weight of her betrayal, that she should sit with that shame. But soon, her sadness turned to something darker, something I couldn't ignore. She'd lock herself in her room for hours at a time, the sound of her muffled sobs slipping through the door late at night. One evening, I heard her talking softly, as though to herself, fragments of words that made no sense, a strange disjointed rhythm that sent a chill through me. One night, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't know who I am anymore. I've destroyed everything." She looked up at me, her eyes vacant. "I feel like I'm disappearing." I wanted to say something, anything to break through the thick fog of despair around her. But my anger was still there, coiled tightly around my heart, and I couldn't bring myself to reach out. I thought about the woman I'd fallen in love with, the laughter we'd shared, the life we'd built, and all I felt was a hollow ache. So I left her there, sitting alone in the dark, and told myself it was for the best. The next morning, she was gone. Her side of the bed was neatly made, her suitcase missing from the closet, and a note lay on the dresser. It was short, written in her small, hurried handwriting. "Tom. I don't know how to fix this, and I don't know how to live with what I've done. I need time to figure out who I am, and maybe find a way to forgive myself. Take care of Emma and James for me. Tell them I love them more than anything. Claire." I read the note over and over, my hands shaking as the reality of her departure settled in. She'd left, just like that, leaving behind a fractured family and 2 kids who didn't understand why their mother had disappeared in the night. I felt a mixture of relief and anger, anger that she'd left us to pick up the pieces, that she'd walked away from the life she'd broken. The days that followed were a nightmare. I tried to explain to the kids, tried to soften the blow, but how could I make them understand? They cried themselves to sleep each night, asking when their mother would come back, and I had no answers. I told myself that this was her choice, her way of dealing with the mess she'd created. Weeks passed with no word. I reached out to her family, friends, even John, desperate for any clue as to where she might be, but no one knew. The silence grew heavier, the emptiness she'd left behind consuming our home, our lives. The kids became withdrawn, their laughter replaced by quiet tears and whispers. I did my best to fill the void, but it was like patching up a sinking ship. And through it all, I felt that old anger fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. Then, one evening, as I was going through some old bills, the phone rang. It was a hospital in a neighboring city. Claire had been admitted weeks earlier, her mental state fragile, her mind fractured by something they couldn't fully explain. They told me she'd been found wandering the streets, disoriented, her memory fading in and out. She'd barely spoken, her only words a request to contact me. I drove to the hospital, my heart pounding as I made my way through the sterile halls, bracing myself for what I would find. They led me to a small, dimly lit room, where she sat on the edge of a bed, her hands twisting in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes empty, her face drawn. "Claire," I whispered, barely able to speak. She looked at me, her face crumpling as she tried to form words. "Tom," she said, her voice a ghost of what it had once been. "I'm so lost." I sat beside her, taking her cold hand in mine, the anger gone, replaced by a hollow ache that throbbed in my chest. In that moment, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me, the woman who had broken our family. I saw the woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, the person who was slipping away before my eyes. I spent hours there, talking to her, trying to pull her back, but it was as if she were already gone, a shell of the woman she'd once been. She looked at me with vacant eyes, nodding, but her words were fragmented, her sentences broken and strange. I left the hospital that night feeling as though I'd lost her twice, once to her betrayal, and now to something darker, something that I couldn't reach. Days later, I got the call. Claire was gone. She'd slipped away in the night, the doctor said, a quiet end to a life that had once burned so brightly. I sat there, the phone slipping from my hand, feeling a numbness settle over me as the reality of her death sank in. The kids, the memories, the shattered fragments of our life together, all of it crashed over me in a wave of grief I hadn't expected. I broke down, the weight of everything hitting me with a force that left me breathless. She was gone, truly gone, leaving behind only the ghosts of the life we'd shared. In that moment, I realized that revenge, anger, even justice had never been what I truly wanted. What I wanted was her back, the life we'd had, the laughter, the love. But it was gone now, leaving only an emptiness I couldn't fill. The kids and I moved on, eventually finding a new normal, a quiet life without her. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of her in the faces of our children, a spark of her laughter, a look that reminded me of the life we'd lost. And in those moments, I felt the ache all over again, a reminder that sometimes, the saddest endings aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones that leave us longing for a life that could have been.